Well, thank you. Yeah, we're gonna have a lot more video today than we usually do. I apologize for that. The reason that we're doing so much video today is that the stuff for what we're on is really good and worth seeing. I try to minimize the video component of the course, but I thought the lecture that's going to introduce the next unit was really good. So with that, we're going to finish with the interviews from the previous unit, where we've been talking about what the land means for the people in it. And without further ado, Jennifer. All the credit. There it is.
And hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Just the volume.
Join a meeting? That was not what I had planned.
No.
Like if it's a fun meeting.
Yeah. That's what they're saying.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for having me, Yossi. What does the land of Israel mean to you?
No.
Where is this new energy?
How does the land of Israel figure in your Jewish life, your spiritual life?
Well, it took me until moving here, and I've lived half my life in Israel now, to realize that Judaism without the land of Israel is really somewhat of a shell. And that, especially being a tour guide, I see somewhat of a shell.
Quite a strong thing.
Yes, it is, because our holidays are agricultural holidays in the main. Pesach is barley and Shavuot is wheat, and all the way through to Hanukkah, which is about the olive oil. And it's the seasons and the rhythm of land and the rhythm of life in the land of Israel that sets the stage for the backdrop of Judaism. So, but it was not something I realized till I lived here and I got into that rhythm myself. But for me, land of Israel is the third leg of a stool that for a long time now really had two legs, which was the people of Israel, and we were mainly dispersed around the world, even though there were always people here, and the Torah, which was really what kept us together, the religion. But now we're back in balance, and the land of Israel is back where she should be in place. And I have a physical love of this land. I drive around as a tour guide. I have the opportunity to go all around the country and meet the people, and it breathes for me. It's not just a place.
Living in Efrat, living the seasons of the land of Israel in harmony with holidays, being a tour guide, bringing tourists to different parts of the land of Israel. What does the land mean to you spiritually, to your inner life? What does it do for you as a Jew living here?
I can't live anywhere else. we travel, I love to travel, but this is home. I absolutely cannot see myself living anywhere else. I feel invigorated here. I feel alive here in a way that I don't feel anywhere else. It's a bigger picture. I'm living for the past, I'm living for the future. I'm raising children here. I think this is the safest place for Jews in the world, bar none. And I think that the future of the Jewish people is here in the land of Israel. And I feel integrated with the place in a way that it's hard to find the words for.
And does that connection with the land of Israel depend on the state retaining the entirety of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea?
I'm not a messianic. I don't know what's going to be in these visions of peace and brotherly love.
But if it were possible.
I'm a practical person.
If it were possible.
If it were possible, I would like to be able to say.
In other words, what is more significant for you? Living in a smaller sovereign Jewish state, or living in part of the land of Israel that would not be under our sovereignty, but by doing so, you would be ensuring an ongoing organic Jewish connection with part of the land of Israel.
But it's not ensuring a Jewish survival. And that's what it comes down to. All these ideas are wonderful ivory tower ideas, Judaism versus democracy and being smaller but retaining who we are. But that ignores the reality. I actually find that a very patronizing and arrogant attitude, if you will. It's like going into a marriage or any relationship and saying, well, it's what I say that counts and what I feel that counts, and completely obliterating the other side. The other side has their reasons for not wanting us here. I don't agree with them, but I accept that that's how they feel. And therefore, since we've had a long, hard road to get here, I don't feel that us giving up land is going to bring to peace. As a matter of fact, from everything that I've heard and from every Arab that I've had this discussion with, it's actually going to lead to national suicide.
Okay, so you've made, I think, a compelling argument for the reality that Jews on the left tend to ignore, which is the enmity on the other side, the refusal to accept our legitimacy. But what about in your camp, the refusal to come to terms with the arguments, the counter arguments, the arguments about demography, the arguments about how can we possibly maintain a Jewish and democratic state when we have a growing Palestinian population, which doesn't even have to reach 51%. It can reach 40%, which it already is more or less now. Then how do we maintain a healthy society? For that matter, how do we continue indefinitely to live? You talk about coexistence with a Palestinian population, but you have citizenship, you have a state, you have a passport, and your neighbors don't. So I'm asking you a lot of questions at once, but it's really coming down to the same question, which is this reality sustainable morally and in the long term politically?
I think that there are creative solutions out there that we have not tried. I don't see why the onus is on me to give the nation that calls themselves Palestinian their rights. There are 23 other Arab states. Why is it the Jewish state that is being told that it's up to us? Because we're the most moral, or even perhaps the only moral country in the region? So then it becomes actually a disability to be moral and upstanding and democratic, because then everybody expects everything from you and not from anybody else, because they know that they won't deliver. It's not really the kind of world I think that we want to live in, where nobody even approaches a totalitarian regime or an absolute monarch, because he's just gonna laugh in your face, if not chop your head off. So I don't see where that is a problem.
I guess the question that I'm really asking is more ethical than political. And the question really, and it's about us.
That's about our kids more than anything.
So on the one hand, we have the imperative of keeping Israel safe.
Yes.
On the other hand, we have this deeply painful situation to many, many Jews, many Zionists, people like myself, who feel, yes, I understand the arguments of security. I understand the argument of our right to all the land of Israel. But at the same time, how can I continue a situation indefinitely where another people that's living next to me, with me, under me, is being deprived of the basic rights that I demand for myself and that I fought for my own people?
Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is simply worse. Look, I resent tremendously the fact that I send my children into a situation when they serve in the army, which they have to do, because somebody has to do it, and we're the somebodies. All right, so of my 7 children, they've all in some way served the state, and the youngest 2 are currently in the IDF. I hate the fact that not only, obviously, they may get hurt one day, but that they may have to hurt somebody else. These are children that I raised not to swat a fly or pick a wildflower. And they're being put in a situation where they may have to take someone else's life. I hate that. But every time that we go for what we call compromise or show weakness in this part of the world, that brings on more violence. So we left Gaza 10 years ago, okay? In that very idea, let them do their own thing, let them have their own space. We won't be there. It was unilateral. We didn't ask anything from them. And what do we get? We have 1.5 million Israelis now living under missile threat all the time. So it's not about our high moral standards, which I do believe in. I think when I talk about the Jews being a light into the nations, I really do believe that. Not that we're better than everybody else, but we were given a job to do. But we have to be alive in order to do it.
Yifaro, toda raba.
Thank you.
So, here you have 2 Jews, one sort of on the left, that's Yossi Klein, well-known writer, also an American immigrant to Israel. Actually, when he was very young, he was part of JDL, Jewish Defense League. He was a follower of Meir Kahane. And then he grew up, he outgrew Kahane, right? And Eve Harrow, on the other hand, who says, you know, this is our land, And yeah, a lot of these things are terrible, but all the alternatives are worse. Who's right? Yeah, Ronnie.
Now, I like the point that you made. Why is the onus on Israel? And there are all these Arab states that could do something to help alleviate the crisis. They could welcome the Palestinians into their land, give them citizenship, everything. Why does it have to be Israel?
And let me take that one step further, okay? So when Israel took the West Bank and Gaza in the 1967 war, they offered to give back a lot of it in return for a comprehensive peace agreement. And then you had the Arab League meeting in Khartoum in 1970, Khartoum, which is interesting irony in, today, now that Sudan has decided to make peace with Israel, right? And the position they took was no negotiation, no acceptance, right? No anything with Israel, right? And so Israel was in a position where, in order to be safe, they had to maintain control over all this land and all these people who didn't want to be part of Israel. And now, well, 2 generations later, now Israel is in charge of all that land. It's like, for young people, it's like, well, this is the way it's always been, right? Israel's the aggressor, right? But historically, that's not so, right? And it was really only after 1970 that the Greater Israel movement took on a certain momentum, right? And the people will say, well, we're not withdrawing from an inch of this land, right? But in 1967, in the wake of the Six-Day War, they were prepared to do that. Or, the government was certainly prepared to do that. The people of Israel, in return for a real peace agreement, were willing to do that.
So is it economic that the surrounding Arab countries do not want to absorb some of the Arabs? Jordan, Lebanon, Syria.
It's not just economic. It is that they see those people as a force for instability. What most of the,
You mean the Palestinians?
yes, what most Muslim countries want more than anything else is stability. Meaning the people who are in charge get to stay in charge. They're not exactly democracies, right? They get to stay in charge. And they should not be used as a training ground for terrorist activity elsewhere, which then would result in consequences for them and the rest of their people, right? Because look at Lebanon. Lebanon is totally taken over by Hezbollah, which is a proxy for Iran. So who can blame the other Arab countries now for saying, well, that's the way things went for Lebanon. That's not what we want. And let's not make any of the Muslim countries or Israel as candidates for sainthood, right? Because they're not. And we don't have saints anyway, so we don't care about that stuff. But you have to respect their interests, right? Yeah, Jerry.
I remember when we went to Jordan and the tour guide was driving around to all the things on the site. And then they pointed to the camp where the Palestinians were,
The refugee camp.
like a refugee camp. And they did not like that. I mean, you could tell by their voice that they didn't have anything to do with those people. They didn't want to maintain it. They didn't want to pay for it. And they would be
Yeah, I
happy,
mean, if
they
you
would
could
be
get-
happy to
If you
escort
could get
them
the
back.
UN to pay for it.
Yeah, well, they said, I almost got the impression, they would be happy to bring all those people and dump them on the Israeli side.
Which is in effect what happened,
Right.
right? Except for the fact that most of those people did live in the West Bank area before 67, right? Now, of course, you're talking about 2 generations later,
And it's nothing's changed.
and nothing's changed.
That's really sad.
Nobody cared to take these people in for understandable reasons. The Israelis weren't prepared to make them citizens, right? Because demographics, right? She talked, about and he talked about the demographic problem, right? Where if you were to include all the Palestinians as citizens of Israel, you're already tinkering with a non-Jewish majority.
How can you do that? I mean, if they're,
Well, and that's why they're not gonna do it,
yeah.
Well, did he say that 40% of the people in Israel, total population, are Palestinian?
Are non-Jewish, are Arab.
That includes the West Bank.
Yes, including the West Bank,
Okay.
right? If you look at the current state of Israel, not including occupied territories, the Arab population is probably something like 10 to 15%. That's my guess.
What does it say on their birth certificate? What country is listed? If they're born in, let's say, Jerusalem, what country is listed on their birth certificate?
Good question. Some of them don't have a country listed, right? I mean, again, if you are Palestinian living in the occupied territories, you don't have Israeli citizenship, you don't have voting rights, right?
Not travel.
I mean, well, you might have voting rights in some respects, in that there are supposed to be elections for the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. Except that, well, as you all know, the president of the Palestinian Authority is in his, 16th year of a 4-year term?
Right.
So, it's not like they're even getting the benefit of that limited democracy. But also, and I think this is part of Eve's feeling as to why things, why you can't make a lot of concessions here. And it is, the Palestinians have been raised on rejectionism. And therefore, if you do another Gaza, you'll get the same results. If Israel were just to wash its hands of most of the West Bank and leave it as, okay, you guys want to have an independent Palestinian state? Bakasha, have at it, right? They'll get the same results, which is that, except then they won't be able to control the presence of a military force in Palestine, which would probably be used continually the same way that Hamas and Islamic Jihad use Gaza. So is she right? Maybe. I mean, it's just a very difficult situation. And from her perspective, totally understand why she would say, not that I like this, I don't like sending my kids into the army and doing what they would have to do, but the alternatives are all worse. And maybe she's right.
international community has forced Israel to survive with one hand tied behind its back.
Right, because God forbid you should actually go in and wipe out Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, it should be, in my opinion, that if Hamas or Hezbollah or the Palestinians on the West Bank want to make war, okay, but the consequence is that you might lose, and in that case, you're gone.
Yeah, except
But
that
the-
that is seen as unpalatable internationally.
Yeah.
Right? So I talked with you before about this, the idea that the war will only be won when Israel wins the war, when there is unconditional surrender on the other side. Right? And that's what they call the Israel Victory Project. Right? But is that really going to work out the way you hope it will? We have enough problems with the rest of the world as it is. Thank you, Ben and Jerry. Right? You want the rest of the world on your back as well because you're winning. So it's a problem. Any other comments or questions on what you saw with Eve Harold? Yeah.
Doesn't Israel provide the utilities and the water and gas and electricity?
Yes, Israel could cut that off
Well, yeah,
anytime it wanted.
that's why right now we're talking about, Russia, what Russia could do to Europe, if they wanted to.
Right, they cut off the gas.
And they would do it. They don't have the same moral fortitude we do as Jews.
Right,
They
well,
can't do it.
Russia, what do you expect?
Yeah, so
I
maybe,
mean,
but we did,
well, our ancestors lived there, we know what we're dealing with there.
but we got a lot of Russian population in Israel too.
Yes, we do,
maybe-
and they know also.
No, but they also have very close ties to Putin because of business relationships.
Some of them, yes.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's one reason why I think Putin has not been quick to jump on the anti-Israel bandwagon. He will at times, but not consistently. He also has an interest in stability, but that can change for him. So, with Putin, you never know, which is one of his strengths, right? That nobody knows for sure what to expect from him, and therefore, that gives him a little bit of power. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Chris.
It seems that one of the corrections that needs to be made for peace is to stop the brainwashing and conditioning of the children. That's from very small to, and it's included in their cartoons. They have Hamas teaching the kids in grade school, kindergarten, junior high.
Right, it's pure anti-Semitic material.
Brainwashing.
A lot of brainwashing and brainwashing with the idea of martyrdom, which is nothing less than child abuse, if you ask me. Right? Tremendous amount of child abuse in the idea of martyrdom, teaching martyrdom for Islam.
Marcia, what was that quote that Golda Meir said? That we won't get peace until something about they value their children more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, really famous quote.
Yes.
He said, making us
Yes,
kill their
yes.
children.
Right, it's all true. So, yeah, I don't think there will be, I'm just not sure that is really the key thing. I think that if there were a Palestinian equivalent to Anwar Sadat, okay?
Mhm.
Look, Egypt had taught hate of Israel for a generation and more. Okay? And then he made peace with Israel, and that was that. There was no more war from Egypt. Now, it doesn't mean that it was a warm peace, but a cold peace is a whole lot of an improvement on war. And that's really all Israel needs. A cold peace would be just fine. Yeah.
Okay, when we were in Egypt before COVID, and our guides were Christian. And they both were of the opinion that when Jews were kicked out in the 50s and 60s, the economy crumbled because they were the shopkeepers, they were the doctors,
You mean
they
of
were the
Egypt?
lawyers, that the economy just went down the tubes. And I'm wondering if Sadat then realized that maybe it had been a bad mistake to expel all the Jews, since they were the bedrock of the economy.
Well, he wasn't gonna get them back.
No.
So
No.
I think Sadat really believed that it was time to give up the dream of driving the Jews into the sea.
He did change his mind.
That's right.
He attacked Israel.
He
changed his mind.
just said, you know, after the Yom Kippur War, it was a little easier for him to do that because they hadn't been as humiliated in the Yom Kippur War as they were in the Six-Day War, when the war was over before it got started. Right? And so he just said, look, you know, this is a good time to make peace, to give up the dream that, which I know and my generals all know it is not gonna happen. And so Palestinians don't care. They don't have that. And they might not get that until the rest of the Muslim world, aside from Iran, continues to make peace with Israel. Yeah, Bob, you were gonna say
Yeah,
something.
that's funny, you say they were not as humiliated, I guess there are degrees of humiliation.
There are,
I mean,
you know,
it's
you
like-
can claim that, oh, we surprised the Israelis, right? Which they did, you know, and no getting around that.
Yeah.
Israel will own up to that, but doesn't mean they really won the war, of course, they didn't.
Their army was surrounded. I mean.
Yeah.
It
So-
took a couple days.
Okay, let's go to the last interview from this unit. This guy, by the way, is a first-rate scholar in Jewish mysticism, Jewish history.
And he's also had a lot of conversations with individual Palestinians. You're talking about, oh, you're not talking about Yossi.
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm talking about Moshe Halbertal,
Okay.
who's the guy you're gonna see here. You,
Jewish, the one in Paul.
Moshe, tov להיות איתך. Thanks. What does the land of Israel mean to you personally, religiously, philosophically, if you will?
I would say, what is the meaning of the holiness of the land for me? By the way, what is the meaning of the category of the holy altogether, which is the most fundamental category of religious life, the sacred? And I think the sacred is the thing that you don't own, the thing that cannot be fully instrumentalized. By the way, when you say that a synagogue is sacred, Kedushat Batei Knesset, you know, the space of a synagogue is sacred. And the Mishnah says the sacredness of the synagogue means you cannot make shelo yaseu kapanrea, you cannot make a shortcut through the synagogue. Right? So the sacred space is the space that you don't own completely, that is not yours to manipulate at will. By the way, what is the sacredness of the Temple Mount for us? It's a place we cannot step on.
But you're giving a spiritual justification, really, for what has been Israeli government policy since the Six-Day War, which is to respect the status quo and restrain our claim to the mount.
Right, by the way, it's fascinating. If you look halachically, the way we respect the sacredness of the mountain is by not entering it.
Now, Moshe, you grew up in Israel in the 1970s. You came of age in the 1970s here in the religious Zionist community, which was a particularly charged moment. That was really the time when the religious Zionist community took the forefront in settling Judea and Samaria. That was the emergence of the settlement movement. Were you attracted in your youth to Gush Amonim, the settlers?
You know, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a religious Zionist home, though my father was, you said, dovish, pragmatic, politically, but there was this enthusiasm of the religious youth after 73 mainly, of, you know, settling, etc. I was part of it, but I was quickly, let's say, disillusioned, but converted back to another, when because of
Back to your father's moderation.
right, when I encountered the reality of the people there, when I realized this is not an empty land. There are people who have, in some ways, no less powerful sentiments towards that piece of land, and that we have to find a place to have a home for both of us here in this land.
You're saying that we have to be willing to give up something that we do have a deep claim to.
Oh yeah, we have attachment, we have a claim. Yes. By the way, a person has the right not to exercise his rights. It's a big thing in life. Because exercising your rights, your historical rights, your attachments, sometimes might mean undermining other deeper moral goals that you have. Sometimes might mean, undermining the rights of others. By the way, I think part of the tragedy of the Palestinian national movement and its incapacity to address the Israelis is their refusal to say to the Jews, look, we understand that you have national religious attachments to this place.
You know, I would actually put it in a different way in terms of us creating a kind of symmetry, which is that I think we need to frankly accept that the Palestinians have an attachment to the entire land between the river and the sea. In the same way that they need to come to terms with the fact that we have an attachment to the same piece of land.
Yeah, and I think if I think about what was missing and still missing in our relationship with the Palestinians, that will move from compromise-based arrangement to genuine reconciliation, is that moment, and they will be capable of saying, we understand your national religious attachment to this place. And we will be capable of saying, we understand that being here caused a lot of pain to you. And not only that, expressing this genuine self-understanding in political ways, in genuine political ways. And I think that's, if you envision something more than just compromise, not justice. I would distinguish between compromise, reconciliation, and justice. Justice always, the claim for actual justice will always undermine peace. But there is a way of reconciling, because nobody would get everything that they want here, or the full justice. And reconciliation should have taken that form.
Reconciliation will require each side to contract its absolute claim,
Right.
its claim for absolute justice over the whole
the kind
land.
of the generosity of spirit. And the capacity of that generosity still I believe to change the heart of the other side in a serious way.
Moshe Albertal, thank you.
No, thoughts? What's your response to that? Yeah, right.
Well, he's absolutely true. The Palestinians have just as much their feeling about the land is no less or no more than the Israelis.
Okay.
That makes it very difficult.
Sure.
You've got people fighting over the same boat.
We had the pleasure of seeing Meyer Kahan in a private meeting. And
Because he liked you so much?
no, because this is a secret meeting. Remember in the hotel room? And Meyer Kahan.
This was a while back.
It's a while back. But, you know, the words he talked about, he was right in everything he said. But, you know, he ends up in the ash bin of history, right?
Yeah. Now, you can always make an argument for the most extreme position, which delegitimizes the other side. You know, particularly when, you know, we were, and to some extent still are, coming to terms with the Holocaust, with a century of pogroms, with, you know, the fact that we have lived in a world that doesn't like Jews very much, or at least, you know, and the best of them, as, I don't know if any of you have seen Dara Horn's new book, right? Which is People Love Dead Jews. Yeah, it is a terrific read. I think it should be must reading for American Jews who want to understand what people are thinking out there, what non-Jewish people are thinking out there. And that's, you know, it's very, very troublesome, and it's hard for us to come to terms with.
Who's the author?
Who's the author?
Dara Horn, H-O-R-N.
I think she's giving
D-A-R-A.
a talk on it at the Vilna Shore.
She's given all sorts of talks on it online. I mean, you can, but the thing you gotta do is read the book. Just to give you an example, right? What is the one book about the Holocaust that every non-Jew reads? Anne Frank, right? How many non-Jews have read a chronicle of the Holocaust from someone who survived it?
Like Ellie Wiesel.
Yeah. Far, far fewer. Right? Right? Because if you only read Anne Frank, you can, you know, as a non-Jew, you can sort of go through that and still believe that people are basically good, just like Anne Frank believed before she was murdered, right? And, you know, you can have all your myths, right? Living Jews make it harder for non-Jews to keep those myths. But nobody wants to give up their myths. I mean, just like the Palestinians don't, you know, bringing us back here, Palestinians don't want to give up their myths. And so maybe, as Halbertal says, the way to go is to allow them to have their myth, just as we have our myth. And I'm using the word myth not as something that's not true, but as a way of looking at things, right? And you know, you allow them to have it, and you allow the Jews to have our myths, and then everybody says, well, okay, now we can get down to business. Right? Now maybe we can figure out a way to make peace while still allowing everybody their view of things. Because if you just try to drill the Jewish myth into the Palestinians. How's that gonna work out? It's problematic, yeah. Anyway, but Dara Horn, great book, and everybody should read it, yeah.
Well, you know, the Nazis rose to power, and part of their rise to power was all the propaganda that they used.
Oh, yes.
And so, you know, they became more and more popular over time. And I'm just wondering about the Palestinians as a people. They're being taught by those in charge that the Jews are horrible. And
Because it fits their
so I
current
think
purpose.
the mass population just needs another, it's the leaders that are causing this propaganda to cause this hatred among the larger population. And just like Germany changed, I think if the leadership would change, I don't think
Yeah.
it's Palestinians in general. You see Palestinian doctors working at Hadassah Hospital and
Right.
all that
And,
kind
you
of
know,
thing.
so there are signs that that's possible, but there is a big difference between the Palestinians today and the Germans at the end of the war in 45. What happened? Germany was defeated.
Defeated,
Was
totally,
totally defeated.
right.
And by the way, what happened? You know, a lot of Germans who had been involved in the war effort committed suicide because they realized they had bought into a false myth. And
I mean,
they couldn't reconcile going on with
Isn't
that.
there now in Israel a member of parliament who is, I don't know if he's Arab or Palestinian, but
He's Arab, yes,
not a member of.
yes. Yeah, so he's the leader of the Arab Party, which actually, for the first time, is part of the ruling coalition in Israel,
Right.
right? You know, with strange bedfellows, nobody ever thought that, you know, at least in this century, that there would be an Arab Party as part of the government coalition, right? But everybody agreed to it. Why? Because it was the only way to get Netanyahu.
The government, yeah.
And everybody in the
After how many
coalition
elections?
saw that that was an important step for going forward. Right? You know, you can love Netanyahu, you can appreciate what he accomplished, but the coalition, as it is today, is made up of people who saw Netanyahu's continuing as prime minister as a detriment to progress on all sorts of fronts. Right? Because after all, Netanyahu was for maintaining the status quo. Right? So, well, all of this complicated, very complicated.
I'm just curious about that book that you gave us.
Yeah.
When
People
you said
love
people
dead
love
Jews.
dead Jews, is it the main focus on Christians,
The main focus is on non-Jews.
non-Jews, so it includes?
It includes non-Christians. Right? She covers a number of different pieces of Jewish history. One of the first chapters, if not the first chapter, talks about this place in northern China where there was a Jewish community for a number of years. And so what have they done? They've set up a museum of, the Jewish community that was here and now is no longer here, right? It totally does not deal with the reasons why that community is no longer there, right? Totally does not deal with any government responsibility or Chinese people responsibility for anything that happened. Yeah.
When we were in Egypt, it was the same thing, they had the Ben Ezra synagogue we went to. There was nothing Jewish about it, It was a museum, it was run by the Egyptians.
Yes, so this is part of Dara Horn's point, which is that people are very happy to make museums about dead Jews.
No, but
Right?
the point.
Now, and by the way, don't think that this doesn't have implications for Holocaust Museum Houston. Okay? Yeah, and there's a lot of non-Jewish money that has gone into Holocaust Museum Houston, right? And of course, some of the work of the museum is broadened to deal with other genocides and other
Human
acts of
rights,
national
yeah.
injustice. Some of which is questionable, but much of which is perfectly within the mission of the museum, right? But when you think about what motivates people to, who are not Jewish, to support a Holocaust museum. I mean, remember, they're not funding Jewish day schools. They're not funding the things that keep Judaism alive. Jewish education, synagogue life, trips to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that we know contribute to Jewish identity and identification, right? There, so some of it is normal, right? I don't expect Presbyterians to fund Jewish day schools, right? But the fact that so much non-Jewish money goes into museums or other things that really have to do with dead Jews is something that you have to take notice of. And we have to understand it because it's part of what troubles much of the world about Israel. People, a lot of non-Jews who are totally appalled at the Holocaust, but who have a big problem with the Jewish state defending itself against Gaza. Right? Yeah. They're throwing bombs from Gaza, right? So, Israelis would say, "Ma pitom." What's the deal with that? What's wrong with our defending ourselves? It's the logical thing to do, right? And we're not destroying Gaza. We didn't turn it into rubble. We're just trying to get at the people who are throwing bombs at us. But a lot of folks, the more successful Israel is with that, the more problems they have.
Because they say, oh, well, it was 100 Arabs and only 6 Jews that died. And I mean, they're saying,
Yeah, which, from my standpoint is, what would you prefer? Would you rather it be the other way around?
I know.
Yeah. So, issues, yeah.
When we were in Israel, they had an attack in a city where we were, and our bus got there like a couple hours after the rockets came. And you would be shocked to see what was piled up there in the parking lot of the shopping center, the number of rockets. And I don't think anybody in the United States really paid any attention to that.
Yeah.
It's like, well,
Well, because it doesn't get a lot of press. The New York Times doesn't print that stuff. That doesn't fit their narrative.
So how does the New York Times, which used to be a Jewish-owned business,
Still is a Jewish-owned business.
but these are,
But it's, but again, they have their narrative. And it's not necessarily the real facts.
They didn't report on the Holocaust at all.
I mean, they had a front page piece showing pictures of all these children from Gaza that had been killed. They never show Israeli children who get killed. So, yeah, I have no problem saying that the New York Times, while it may be one of the premier institutions for news in the world today, is absolutely off the mark for reasons that you can trace historically when it comes to matters of Israel and anti-Semitism. And I think that, we have to understand that. right? You know, when, a few years back, when they printed that cartoon of a dachshund, right? With the face of Netanyahu, right? That was totally out of bounds. That was a totally anti-Semitic stereotype, right? Well, I gave a talk about it, you know, but New York Times doesn't pay attention to my talk, so that's the way it goes.
Yeah, but the only way we can do anything is not give money, buy their newspaper.
So fine, so you know, the New York
We gotta
Times
vote with our
stock
pockets.
price does not depend on whether I subscribe. I
Right.
don't subscribe, I won't
I
subscribe,
don't even want to
But-
look at the New York Times.
but that's, well, I don't mind looking at it. I get the morning report in my email, doesn't cost me anything, and so I don't care, right? And I'll take from it what I can get, and I'll see whatever else they might be doing wrong. But it's funny because the head of foreign affairs at their Washington office, who's way up there, is a Jewish boy who came from Oklahoma City.
Did you ever read FDR on the Jews? Because.
Well, I know the story.
Yeah,
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 I mean, yeah.
but
Yeah,
he,
FDR is another, case, and of course, Jews lionized him because politically he fit with where we were at.
But his policy was.
But his policy toward the Jews,
Yeah, we
forget
have
about
to
it.
win the war, we can't make it, oh, well, we're doing something for the Jews.
Right,
That
no,
was,
God
you know.
forbid.
Taking off the table the fact that the Jews killed Christ, which has now been. Why is there so much animosity? Why are the Jews so hated?
Okay, so, yeah, that's another course.
I don't know if I can.
I will just give you my opinion, and I think I've said it in one of these courses. Jennifer remembers, so, so I think I'm remembering right.
But it's worth repeating many, again and
Maybe it's
again.
worth repeating. So, years ago, there was a book by Joseph Telushkin and Dennis Prager called Why the Jews? Right? And they examined this question. And their answer was, I assume still is, that it is psychological in nature. Now, don't think about Judaism the way you think about it. Think about it from the point of view of a non-Jew, right? It is the Jews who brought God's moral law to the world, right? You may not really believe that, but it's not, in the psyche of many non-Jews, it's a fact. It's not even something questionable, it's a fact. And certainly if you are a believing Christian, after all, the New Testament is based on the Old, right? On the Hebrew Bible. And therefore, they understand that to be the case. Now, many non-Jews, including Christians, are grateful to the Jews, right? Because it's people like you and me, from their perspective again, it's people like you and me who kept God's moral law alive. Okay? I'm not done. I'm not done. The problem is, not everybody likes God's moral law. Not everyone appreciates God's rules for the universe, God's moral rules. Can they take it out on God? That's difficult. Guess who they take it out on? Again, it is a psychological reason, which explains why there is anti-Semitism even in countries that have no Jews, which these days are very few. Right? There are a lot of places where there are just, a handful of Jews. There's almost no place that has no Jews.
So it's not the fact that the Jews
But what-
own Hollywood.
The Jews own,
the
all of
the
these
Jews
are
own-
excuses. These are justifications, things that people hear or read that tap into their own psychological thinking. And there's not a tremendous amount you can do about that until those people actually sit down with real Jews, which rarely happens, right? Because they won't. Rarely happens. But sometimes when they do, the myths are broken and their psychological view changes, right? But anti-Semites in general, this is the thinking of Prager and Telushkin, that it's, it's not this scapegoat stuff. Those are, it's not the Jews own the media, the Jews own the banks. It's all, after the fact justifications for a real prejudice. And by the way, this also explains why there is anti-Semitism both on the right and on the left politically, right? Because
They call
it really
anti-Israel.
doesn't matter. I'm sorry?
They call it anti-Israel, not anti-Semitic.
Right, well, yeah, most anti-Israel stuff
Right,
is clearly anti-Semitic,
right.
whether it's from the right or the left.
But you're going
Makes
back
no difference.
hundreds, almost 2,000 years. In 400, around 400 AD, wasn't it one of the popes that, really encouraged anti-Semitism? And therefore, you saw the Crusades, you saw the expulsion from Spain, you saw the Holocaust. All these anti-Semitic acts were ingrained in Christians year after year after year by the church.
Yes,
And so,
yes. And so to think that we're gonna weed that out of the church in 1 century,
right.
it's not so
It's
simple.
not even 1 century.
Yeah,
When
but-
did the
but
Pope do it,
again,
1980 or something
Yeah,
like that?
but again, remember that if it is psychologically rooted, then regardless of church dogma can change, but people's minds don't necessarily change, right? You will find occasional Catholics who, even though the church changed course on theology relating to the Jews almost 60 years ago, right? There are still Catholics who subscribe to the old theology. Why? Because it suits their psychology, and psychology trumps theology. Just as there are a lot of people who believe in certain things, not because they're rational, but because that's their mindset. You can't change the mindset so easily, right? Same thing here with
Drawing the
anti-Semitism.
bullseye around the arrow.
Yeah, absolutely,
I mean,
absolutely.
Jews have lived in countries for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet they were not considered citizens of those countries.
Correct,
I mean,
correct. And even after they were still seen as outsiders. Right? Citizens with the right to vote, but untrusted. Why do, when the Jews did have an outsized control over the movie industry, right? Most of those Jews who were involved at that level took great pains to distance themselves from anything significantly Jewish. Did that change anybody's minds? Not an iota. Because in the non-Jewish mind, particularly in the anti-Semitic mind, the Jew is the Jew is the Jew, and always will be. And if he's Satan, well, that's the way it is. He's not going to change. Satan doesn't change. So this, you know, I give a lot of credence to this explanation for anti-Semitism. There is tremendous resistance to it because what it suggests is that the job of confronting anti-Semitism is a great deal more difficult than we would like to believe it is. We would like to believe, like Anne Frank, that people are basically good. Well, there are people who are basically good. And there are also a hell of a lot of people who are not there yet.
Who did you say the authors were?
Dara, Telushkin and Prager. Joseph Telushkin, Telushkin, and Dennis
Prager's our radio talk show.
Yeah, and by the way, this is a book that was written almost, I mean, it's 35 years ago or so.
Oh, okay.
Dennis Prager, in recent years, has really gone crazy.
Listen to his radio show.
He's way out in right field. To the extent that he basically exposed himself to COVID deliberately, wouldn't take the vaccine, right? Not only wouldn't take the vaccine, but got COVID, deliberately exposed himself to it, and was taking this cow medicine, ivermectin, to deal with it. Well, Prager's not going to die from COVID. That's okay. That's good news, I guess. But he's just gone. I can't say it in this company. He's just gone off the rails.
The book has been updated, though, by the way. The original book, Why the Jews, has been updated about 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, is it
I didn't read
substantially different?
I don't know. I didn't read the new. I didn't think it was worth reading again.
Yeah. Yes, Bob.
Well, when will some people learn that
Please, that's already a question beyond my capacity.
downplaying, I was gonna say denying, but not denying, like, not the movie people, downplaying your Jewishness. They don't deny it.
Oh,
That's
well,
not-
yeah.
it's not
Yeah,
protected
so
from anti-Semites.
it really makes no difference to the anti-Semite whether you are demonstrably Jewish or if you're just hiding it,
Exactly.
because you're evil to begin with anyway.
Exactly. So
why not just be Jewish?
why not just, exactly, why not just be
Yeah,
Jewish?
right.
Yeah.
No, so, to me, that's fine, except I don't think it's a great argument for keeping Shabbos. I don't think you should keep Shabbos. I think everybody should keep Shabbos, right? But I don't think you should keep Shabbos because you're going to spite some anti-Semite. To live your life in spite of somebody else is a recipe for other mental problems that you don't need. Okay, we're at the end of our time. We didn't get to the lecture I was hoping we were going to hear today. But we will
So just hold that thought for next week.
hold that thought for 3 weeks.
Oh, great.
Because we are off the next 2 weeks, and we'll start with that unit next time.
Which one would you recommend? Rabbi, which book should I read?